Thank you. Fantastic to see so many folks here. We have a book. It's 2 years old now, which in the tech world is ancient, but I think there's still some decent approaches to sort of understand this issue, because what we're going to talk about today is, first of all, if anyone here thinks of themselves as already knowing a lot about cybersecurity, this may not be the talk for you. We're going to sort of unpack the term cybersecurity and talk about how we can think about various solutions to what we're looking for. I'm going to talk a little bit about what NTIA does in cybersecurity and what our multi-stakeholder approaches are. And then at the end, we'll do the how you can stay safe online as part of National Cybersecurity Awareness Month. So, once upon a time, we had just plain old security. It was computer security, it was information security, and it was a nice, narrow niche issue that I did a lot of research in. And then one day, everything got pretty crazy about, sorry, I was advancing the wrong slides, how embarrassing. So here is where you should be paying attention. Feel free to ignore anything that doesn't strike your fancy. So one day, all of a sudden, cybersecurity became this big hot button issue. So this is an image from the cover story of The Economist. That's how you know you've made it, is when your issue is covered in The Economist. Cover story in 2010. And at the time, still at Harvard, so I had some students do an analysis of what did this article actually talk about. And this is just simply breaking down by paragraph, triple-coded, one article on cyber war. Touched on critical infrastructure, economic espionage, the intelligence community, international law, tech, crime. And the first takeaway is that there is no intellectual discipline. There is no single part of the government. There is no human being that can track and analyze all of these issues. We've taken this term cybersecurity and we've used it to cover all manner of sins. And so when we start looking for what the solution is, just as we shouldn't expect any one solution for all of these issues, we shouldn't expect any one solution for cybersecurity. To use one of the most overused tropes, there is no silver bullet, and frankly, we're lucky if we can find some lead. So, we've got this term, cybersecurity. And what does it cover? Well, it's helpful to break it down into 3 different areas. We've got conflict, crime, and competitiveness. So the conflict part, cyber war. People have been focused on this cyber war. Will the next war be fought with cyber? Yes, of course it will. Right? The next war will always be fought with whatever is on hand. Couple of things that make this particularly noteworthy when we're talking about cyber conflict. One, all of our systems are dependent on information technology, and so if someone attacks that, they can essentially undermine your systems. Now, they can also take out the power grid with a large bomb. We shouldn't underestimate the impact of how traditional conflict has been working. The United States has been involved in plenty of conflicts over the past 2 decades, and there hasn't been dramatic cyber attacks against the United States. In fact, what we have seen, and something that I don't think we've fully anticipated in this book, is the use of information domain not at the system level, not talking about technology, but the use of information as a domain of conflict when we're actually talking about human brains and the type of information that we absorb. That's something that I don't think our country was fully prepared for, and it's something that we're going to have to learn how to deal with. In addition to hardening our systems, we need to understand how our institutions are resilient to information warfare. But we're not going to talk quite as much about that today. We're going to talk a little more about the other 2, which are the civilian sides of government, crime and competitiveness. And just a very quick overview, one of the interesting things about cybercrime is that it's surprisingly hard to make money. We're going to talk a little bit about credit card theft, just because that's something that I think a lot of us have heard about and understand. If Milton steals my credit card, what can you do with it? What is really at risk? And sorry, Stacy's. Well, turning it into cash is actually surprisingly difficult, right? If you have 1 million credit cards, actually getting money out of that much, you actually have to sell it and sell it further on and sell it further on. That's why modern cybercrime gangs are actually incredibly well organized. The value of a credit card number and expiration date on the open market that was recently sold by a trusted criminal on the black market, less than $10, because it's so hard to extract value. That's why the rise of something called ransomware, where someone will take over your machine and hold it hostage, is such a brilliant innovation. I'm surprised it took us this long to get that far, because they realized it's really hard for me to extract value from your data. You know who really values your data? You do. And so that is why we've seen this evolution into ransomware. But if we're tackling crime, the trick is to understand, why do we rob banks? It's where the money is. How do we make it harder and harder to extract value? When we're thinking about crime, we want to understand, that we don't expect to get rid of all crime. When I walk down the street and I get mugged, it's sad. But that is not something that necessarily needs to be a social priority. I miss my iPhone, but this is okay. If I walk down the street and I get mugged, and the paper writes about it, and then other people get mugged, and pretty soon people stop walking down that street, then it becomes a systematic risk. Because now we're doing harm to the businesses on that street. Businesses go out of business, people move away, tax base goes down. We have put the ecosystem at risk. So we want to understand the social impact of making sure that we still have trust in the ecosystem that we talk about. And then finally, there is the theft of competitive data. I think a lot of people have heard of, we have countries and criminal gangs stealing secrets from American companies. This is a tricky issue because it's very easy, I think, to overstate the consequences. And I just want to be clear now that I'm speaking based on prior research I've done, independent of my work here at the Commerce Department, to understand what is the impact of someone stealing competitive data. One of the things we learned in the 1990s from the intellectual property debates is that if someone downloads an album that would otherwise cost $20 in a store, we can't say that that criminal has stolen $20. We have to look at the impact in terms of how we've changed the market. And happy to dive into this a little bit more in the future, but understanding that impact in the global marketplace is very important. I'll give you an example. Coca-Cola was hit by a very sophisticated attack in 2010. Did they go after the secret formula for Coca-Cola? No. No one cares about that. There was a whole This American Life episode about how easy it is to find the recipe online. Well, what happened? About 2 months after, so less than that, about 2 weeks after the attack happened, and we didn't know about it for another year, but 2 weeks after the attack happened, the Chinese government nixed Coca-Cola International's plan to buy the second largest soft drink bottler in China. Wall Street expected this deal to go through. Coca-Cola expected this deal to go through. It is my belief that the Chinese government discovered that there was something in the numbers that made it disadvantageous to the Chinese government to allow that sale to go through. What is the actual effect? Is it's changing the decision-making we have. The value isn't necessarily the secret formula, it's the strategic data that you're going to use to buy someone else's secret formula, because now someone can outbid you very easily. So what we've covered here is to show that there are different types of threats. Each of these threats has very real impact, but we need to understand what that impact is if we're going to deal with it. And part of that involves understanding what's the value at risk. Is it something that is about dollars and cents, where we can figure out how to deal with it from a financial perspective, or is it something that represents a threat to overall society? Turning off the power grid in the winter in New York City, or perhaps even worse, in the summer in Phoenix. How are we going to deal with these threats depends on what's the value at risk. So what are the risks? How do we get here? First, there's this notion of complexity. Information technology is ridiculously and delightfully complex. Back when everything was in analog or very simple circuits, there was a finite number of states. You could predict how systems were going to get into the current state. Everything followed a very clean flow line. When we moved into the world of zeros and ones, the problem got combinatoric, right? State A could be on or off. State B could be on or off. 2 things, now I have 4. I had another bit, 8. Another bit, 16 potential states. When we're dealing with millions of lines of code, understanding how every state of that system could be in, every potential configuration, is not something that we can easily and accurately map out. And things are getting more complex all the time. There are more lines of code that are in an F-150 pickup truck than were in Windows 95. We are finding this approach, and it is everywhere, right? This technology is being built into every facet of our lives, and we're connecting it. We have this approach all over, where all of a sudden, my watch talks to my phone, which talks to the network. Every single thing that we add to the network has the further ability to connect elsewhere. Things route to the cloud, which then route back out into the greater world. Adding that connectivity also gives us that exponential growth. There's a lot more that's complex, and tracking what is connected and what isn't connected, and making sure that we can actually understand the flow of information gets too hard when you have a billion devices that can talk to another billion devices. It's a billion times a billion. We talk about air gapping a system, and it's very easy to design a system that doesn't connect to anything else. It's just very hard to use that system to do anything useful, because you need to get data off your computer. Otherwise, why have a computer? You need to update the instructions because the world changes. You need to have some people who, show up on the weekend and sit at a desk and, just they want to play a game, so they connect to the internet. People find a way around security policies. And of course, perhaps most important for our building is the role of the private sector. I've talked to senior military strategists who just are very annoyed. They want to fight a war in cyberspace, and they're really annoyed at these civilians that are in their domain of conflict, which drives me crazy because it's not their domain. All of this is built and managed by the private sector. The networks are paid for and run by the private sector. The pipes that run under the tables, the airwaves that we manage, and we're talking about a Wi-Fi, even what we use to defend ourselves as the government comes from innovators in the private sector. So when we're thinking about how we're going to secure ourselves, the discussion has to start with the notion that the security is around the private sector. Now, there are some people who want to push back on that and say, listen, the role of government has to be more complex. If we're dealing with state actors attacking us, in World War II, we didn't expect factories to put anti-aircraft guns on the roof of their buildings. And that's an important point to raise, that in the domain of international conflict, we don't give private actors that responsibility or that role, right? We don't want companies starting international incidents themselves. But we need to understand that when it comes to protecting critical infrastructure around us, those are decisions that are made by for-profit entities. When it comes to innovations of what the next tool is going to be, those are decisions that are going to be made by people who want to sell things. And that has to be part of our discussion. So, how do we start thinking about securing this insecurity? Well, we talk a lot in security about the CIA Triad. This is confidentiality, integrity, availability. Concepts aren't terribly difficult. Confidentiality, just keeping your data private. This is tools that we use for things like encryption, but also data minimization. This is also a network issue of, what are you connecting? Availability is also pretty straightforward. Can I use this service? Or is someone trying to deprive me of that? They're overloading a network with bad traffic so that people who need to use that service can't access it. Integrity is probably the hardest and the most insidious, because we depend on computers to tell us what's going on. And integrity is to undermine the validity of the data and the state of the system. So I don't know if people have heard of the Stuxnet attack. This was a cyber attack against the Iranian nuclear program. And what made it so insidious is we didn't blow up, don't say we. The program wasn't blown up. Iran was trying to enrich uranium. They had centrifuges. The centrifuges were spinning normally. The computers all looked like they were doing the job. And yet what came out of the centrifuges was not weapons-grade uranium, because there were very subtle tweaks in the control system, the computers that ran the control system, to make sure that the centrifuges weren't operating as they were supposed to, even though the computer said they were working on it. So this is something that is quite frightening in terms of saying, how do we actually know and trust the systems on which we've all come to depend? But there's a further issue that I think we need to acknowledge, which is the importance of resilience. In 2017, we are not going to have an attack-free world, just as we're not going to have a crime-free world in any domain. The challenge is, how do we make sure we can manage, we can muddle along under adverse conditions? So resilience, very easy to describe at high level, which is, right, it's the ability to operate while someone's trying to do bad things to your network. It's the ability to operate while under attack or while there's still threats and risks at play. Unfortunately, if you start to go a level down and say, well, how do I get resilience? Then it becomes a little bit like the famous Supreme Court definition of pornography. We'll know it when we see it. Because every organization, every institution is going to have a different arrangement and is going to make different decisions. Maybe you will have a backup generator, or maybe you'll just have spare parts, so when a generator breaks, you can bring another one online. Or maybe you'll have a contract with someone across town so that you can get power from them. There are many ways that we can have this. The other challenge of resilience, and I'll get into the markets aspect later, is this is not something that is cheap. Resiliency also often involves having spare capacity. It involves redundancies. No one likes redundancies. We're really good at trying to get rid of redundancies. People accuse us and the government of having too much redundancy. In fact, I think one of the things that is very impressive about government agencies is we are quite resilient. As we need to spin up and work under crunch time, we can do that. We have that capacity. That's a good thing. So let's think about security in terms of, so we've got our basics, CIA plus resilience. But what do we need? Is this a technical problem? Well, in part, it is going to be a technical problem. So credit card theft was rampant. People were swiping credit cards, and right, your data is in the clear. This is the sort of thing that you can teach a precocious 10-year-old over a weekend how to do credit card fraud. So what did we do? Well, the United States, a little bit behind the times, adopted the smart chip on everyone's credit card. That is a technical countermeasure against fraud. It's much harder. It's not impossible, but now it's much harder to take the data that is on the credit card mag stripe and use it without having the appropriate chip. So that's right, technology can help. And if we're thinking about security, we do need to understand certain aspects of technology. So for example, people have heard of antivirus. People have heard of the term firewall. Those terms are baked into American law, into American regulation. However, the technology has evolved past this. Antivirus is still fairly important, but this is actually a controversial topic. There are people who give talks saying modern organizations don't need and shouldn't invest money in antivirus. Why? Well, one, the malware, the viruses that are attacking us are too hard to spot. Right? The way classic antivirus works is it looks for a fingerprint. It looks for a signature that says this piece is a known piece of bad software. Anytime I see this, I'm going to say that's bad, kick it off. That's not how modern malware works. You know, you see there are articles of, we found 1 million pieces of malware on this one system. Well, that's not saying much. That's like saying there are 1 million molecules in this water bottle. What you care about is the water and where it's going. Every piece of malware now comes with the ability to automatically change its signature and its presentation. Similarly, we talk about firewalling. Let's keep the bad stuff off the network and the good stuff, allow the good stuff to move around. That's great if you can actually tell what's good and what's bad. Security researcher famously joked that what we need on the internet is every packet that flies around the internet, we just need a bit called the evil bit. And bad guys are required to set the evil bit, and then our firewalls can just detect whether or not the evil bit's been set. That would be a very efficient solution. Of course, This is impossible, and determining what is good and bad is difficult. And it gets more difficult because there are other things that we need, right? We need to use encryption on the internet to prevent bad guys from spying on our data. Well, that means that it's harder for defenders to know whether or not the traffic is also good or bad. So there are many challenges when we're trying to have this discussion. We need to look under the hood and actually have some awareness. It is my belief that technology policy requires some understanding of technology. But you don't need to be an expert. I think most issues can be solved or can be addressed and talked about with 3 or 4 technical details. Once you know those, once you've captured 3 or 4 technical details, the rest is genuinely a policy discussion. It's about costs and benefits, and it's about political discussions. But knowing what those technical details are, for that you need some technical know-how in the room. And that's why these discussions have to have engineers. But we shouldn't depend on engineers. Why? Because security is also about organizational change. So we've got our example of the credit card, right? So we've put some technology to make it harder to forge the credit card data. But modern credit card companies, modern stores still have to have that data flowing around their networks. And they have to make decisions about how that data is going to move, how it's going to be protected, and what they're going to invest in. And this is something where we've spent a lot of time in this department. So, how does an organization think about this? They need to identify what are the risks. They need to figure out how to protect them. They need to detect adverse reactions. They need to respond when attacks happen. And they need to be able to recover afterwards. This is from the NIST Framework, possibly the most important piece of cybersecurity policy in the entire world. This is what the US government now depends on working with the private sector. It comes to the NIST framework. Happy to talk a little about this. My colleagues at NIST can do much better job explaining it. So understanding organizational change of how we help organizations do this is absolutely critical. So the final aspect that we need to think about security. So we've got technology, we've got organizations, and we have markets. Right? This is the Commerce Department. This is absolutely critical. So let's go back to our credit card theft example. What's fascinating and what I love about the credit card theft model is it's actually fairly rational right now. There are a variety of different market actors, and we have policy, both federal and contractual, that assigns responsibility for fraud. So right now, if I wake up tomorrow morning and my bank account is empty, I will go to my bank and they will say, well, it looks like you sent all your money to Moldova last night. And I will say, I didn't send all my money to Moldova last night. And my bank manager will ask me one question. He will say, are you sure? Now, I can't lie to her, right? That's a felony to misrepresent. That's fraud. But once I have attested that that was a malicious transfer, it was a fraudulent transfer, I am made whole to the FDIC limit, $250,000. Now, what does that mean? It means the bank has a responsibility to try to detect fraud. But the bank also wants to make it very easy to send money to Moldova when I am actually planning my next great Moldovan wine vacation. And so the challenge that the bank has to face is to make a risk calculation. How much fraud do we want to absorb versus how much business do we want to lose? How much do we want to increase the costs of customer support? And I would argue that is a rational decision. That is where we want risk decisions being made, and that's the type of risk decision we want to be made. So the real question is, what do these markets look like when we think about market solutions? And the problem is sometimes markets do fail. Why? Why is there this failure in the security marketplace? Because there are, as you know, lots and lots of security attacks and security breaches happening out there. There are a couple of reasons. First and foremost, security is expensive. This stuff is really hard to detect. You have to hire smart people. There is negative unemployment in the security space. If you're in a position to offer career guidance to people right now, Pushing them in this direction is going to be very powerful. But not only is it expensive, it's also a cost sink. Right? A company has to choose between hiring a salesperson or spending money on security. They have to choose between innovating about new market products or spending on security. That's a real threat that is hard for those of us who spend all of our days thinking about security. Why don't people spend more money? Well, because there's a finite amount of resources, and companies are not in the business of protecting their networks. Companies are in the business of business. One of the real challenges is making a case for return on investment for security. We know how to do this for IT, and in fact, this is commonplace, right? I need to spend this much money on IT. This is how it's going to transform my business. It's going to affect my mission. We can do that even inside the US government. For security, it's much harder for a couple of reasons. One, the risks are a little amorphous and vague. Will I be breached? Maybe. How much will a breach cost? Don't know. Is it really important that I defend against this breach? Possibly. If I buy this product, how much does my risk go down? This is probably the most important research question in security space today. I say that as someone who does security economics. Obviously, there are people in different areas who would argue otherwise. Is helping think through how do we measure the value and the metrics for investing in security. One of the reasons that it's hard is because we have an asymmetric information model here. People are familiar with the market for lemons, right? We don't know, when you don't know the quality of your product, it's very hard to know how much to price it. And if you don't know how to price good things, then pretty soon bad things will replace good things. There is a lot of money in security. The largest cybersecurity conference is RSA. Last year it had 40,000 people. A booth on the RSA Expo floor that is about the size of this stage will cost $30,000 just for the real estate to show your product. And every product on there is going to say, we do this. What's the problem du jour? What's the threat du jour? Is it data exfiltration? Hey, the blinking box that we tried to sell you last year to detect ransomware. Turns out that same product, also great for detecting when someone's trying to exfil data from your network. Who knew? Sometimes this can be good, right? We want people to sort of understand what to invest, but it's very hard, even for sophisticated actors, sophisticated market players, to know what they're actually getting and how different pieces of the economy fit together. You know, defining what efficacy means in security is difficult, especially because no one can make any guarantees. And then the final aspect is the tragedy of the commons, where we have interconnected risk. When my camera, my security camera, is busy blasting away on the internet at some company, knocking them offline because they didn't pay a ransom to a blackmailer, do I care? It doesn't really affect the quality of me making sure that I can see what's going on in the alley behind my house. What are the harms in making sure that my stuff isn't secure when often the damages occur to other people? And more importantly, the investments that can sometimes protect me require your cooperation, participation, or even you spending money. And understanding those externalities is very important, and that's where I think government has to play a very clear role in raising awareness and in working with companies to understand that. So how can government change private behavior? There's a bit of a spectrum. On one end, you have a prescribed process, classic, good old-fashioned command and control regulation. Do this. Graham Leach Bliley, HIPAA for healthcare. The energy sector has very clear prescriptions. You must patch things. Right? There are clear rules we can say you must do this. Those tend to not be very popular, and it also is difficult. As I've talked about, what we need to do changes over time. So we need a process that can keep up with that. At the other end of the spectrum, we rely on market deterrence. My favorite example for this is data breach laws. I'm assuming everyone has gotten the notice that, whoops, we have accidentally lost your data, sorry, here's a year of free credit monitoring. That's a lovely example where the government didn't say, companies have to protect my data. Companies can do whatever they want to with my data. But if they lose control over it, then they have to tell me. And telling me does cost a little bit of money. They have to notify it. They have to risk their professional brand. They end up in the papers. That imposes internal incentives. And by the way, it's created these lovely external markets. There are now turnkey solutions of who do you call when you have a data breach. There are companies that specialize in helping you audit against the particular risk of a breach of private information. There's even insurance, and during Q&A we can talk about insurance. I have a little rant. But there's insurance where it does work, is you can get data breach insurance as a company. Now in the middle, in between these approaches of pure compliance versus laissez-faire and accountability or punishment at the end, is the notion of risk evaluation. So this is, I think, fundamental to understanding security because at the end of the day, it is about risk. One of my favorite professors in grad school once said, no one is leaving the room until everyone fundamentally agrees with the following statement. The optimal number of plane crashes is greater than 0. We should not expect perfect security. It's a famous phrase that the perfectly secure computer is one that is unplugged and turned off. Again, not very useful. Understanding what the risks are and how to mitigate them is absolutely critical to the security process. There are tools available in the private sector. The NIST Cybersecurity Framework has been instrumental at helping companies understand that and build a roadmap for maturity. The challenge is when we start to say, you must have a risk model, because that's when it goes from suggesting critical thinking to you have to make a particular decision. You have to demonstrate that you have followed a particular thought process. And we have a law on the books that says, we're not going to tell you what to do, but for this particular type of risk, you need to tell us how you're addressing it. And it's so important that you even need to have your CEO sign this piece of paper when he hands it to the government. Anyone know what law I'm talking about? There's a hint. Anyone think that SOX, Sarbanes-Oxley, is a really good piece of regulation? Right, it is universally understood as a pretty terrible piece of regulation that has succeeded in enriching consultants, if not actually having any real impact on the stability of our financial system. So that's the challenge of requiring this risk evaluation process. We're still trying to figure this out. So, what do? We have Congress to help us. It'll take a little while. And it's also not nuanced, right? It's a very blunt object to try to apply something to the entire economy. And in the best of times, in the most optimistic lens, it is not the most efficient process. Right? Well, we've got regulation. Regulations aren't very popular in the best of times. And we're the Department of Commerce. We don't like regulation. We like to actually get things done. Regulations are also still a blunt instrument. So what do we have left? Well, there's a lot of great work that's happening in this department. We have the NIST framework that I've talked about. We have developing technical standards so that technology can work together. ITA plays a very instrumental role in making sure that companies aren't using cybersecurity to limit trade and still working to make sure that we have cybersecurity built into some of these trade agreements that we're talking about. BSA works to understand the risks that are hitting particular industries. There is really good work that is happening in this building using voluntary models and helping industry work together. And that's a lot of what NTIA does. So I like to use the following mental exercise, which is, let's assume that we had really strong incentives, like really strong incentives. We were to go to CEOs and say, if arbitrary security issue isn't resolved, we're to start amputating fingers. That would get the attention of the board, right? That would drive change. But change doesn't happen because the person at the top of the stack says do this. Change happens because organizations need to transform. And yes, the incentives at the top are altered, thanks to our friend here, but what we really need to do is understand what the pathway of what that change is going to look like. And once we can tell that story of suppose we had these incentives, what would the change look like? Then I think, rather than jumping straight to this, we can start to say, well, what's the world look like where that's easier and cheaper? How do we tell a story where there's a shared vision of what change looks like across an ecosystem? And how can we make that happen? Now, if you're doing that voluntary, it means you need buy-in and you need the perspectives across the community. And so that's a little bit of what NTIA does. We have this thing called the multi-stakeholder process. It's come to us through the internet governance community. Happy to chat a little about that. My other NTIA colleagues know a lot more than I do about that. And essentially, it's about bringing different stakeholders together and building consensus on particular well-defined issues so that then we can say, this is now the shared expectation on this particular issue. Now, it's not always the most efficient process. And that's something we have to work with. People show up, and some of them just want to rant. Sometimes organizations don't send us their best and brightest. We get the professional meeting-goer class. And so we have to work a lot and say, no, here's what we're looking for, here's how we're trying to accomplish goals. And we have to work hard to make it happen and follow these principles. So what are those principles? These processes are open. Anyone can join. And open doesn't just mean open the door. It means we have to go out into the world and say, this is a stakeholder community that's not represented. We don't have someone from civil society. It's really important that we have the free speech perspective at the table here. It's transparent. We work very hard to make sure that the documents and the process and the discussion are easily viewable. There are a number of $500 an hour K Street lawyers who seem to do nothing but watch what we do to make sure we're not sneaking in regulations somehow through the back door. So we have to work with them. It's consensus-based. You can't have voting. It's not one person, one vote in this model. But also that means you don't require unanimity. You're not going to let one particularly difficult person, and believe me, we have some difficult people in these communities, especially in the security world, derail a process. But at the same time, you can't have a process where the outcome, everyone is on board except for one community. Everyone says that this sector needs to do stuff. This sector's not wild about being told by the entire world that it needs to do something. We need to get buy-in from everyone. And of course, it needs to be results-oriented. We need to frame it so that we're not just saying, let's have a discussion about the importance of security. Let's be concrete. So what does that mean? It means we don't reinvent the wheel. We try to make sure that we know what else is out there before we start it. We want to actually make a difference. We need to explicitly acknowledge that there is no one-size-fits-all solution. That what we're trying to accomplish is something that can be used by small businesses, by large businesses, by people around the world, having to be international. We want to understand what the guiding principles of the issues are and try to figure out how we can expand on them and have a greater impact. So we've done this for a little while now. The first issue we looked at was something called vulnerability disclosure. This started off as an obscure fight in the hacker community, and in the past 2 or 3 years, coincidentally, as long as NTIA has been working on it, has become a fairly mainstream topic. Security has flaws. Sometimes people find them. When they're nice, they tell you about them. What we don't want is to have the attacker, the people who are reporting it, be seen as adversarial. compared to the people who are responsible for maintaining and building the systems on which we all depend. How do we foster a system of collaboration? Well, that means that we actually need to understand what the incentives are on both sides and lowering the barrier to collaboration. So what did we do? Well, we changed the discussion. We brought them both together. At the first meeting, both sides came and were angry at NTIA. They stood up and yelled at me. One side stood up and yelled at me and said, this is a dumb idea. The other side stood up and yelled at me and said, this is a dumb idea. And they looked across the room and said, we're not so different, you and I. We both hate Allan. And that really, I think, helped, I only exaggerate a little bit, helping people just be in the same room and use their I statements builds empathy and allows people to say, oh yeah, many aspects of this problem are not necessary and we can find solutions. We don't have to solve everything, but we can find some real solutions. We have a current initiative right now on the Internet of Things. Folks are familiar with the Internet of Things. This is you take things and you put them on the internet. Your toaster, your toilet, everything from toys to Toyotas now is internet enabled. This is fantastic. We can collect data, we can use data, we can track things. I don't know what you're tracking here, but I'm sure there's some people who take this very seriously about tracking data from every aspect of their life. But you may have heard the line that there is the S in IoT stands for security. In fact, it's so popular, there's a mug out there. Right? The S, in a word without the S, clearly indicating security is not something that is built into this. So how to react? Well, there are a number of people that say, well, you know what? Instead of building things insecurely, why not build them securely? Gosh, why didn't we think about this? This concept of secure by design is lovely in theory, but a little difficult in practice. It's a little bit like saying, excuse me, do you know where I am? And responding, well, yes, you're lost. It's not wrong, it's just not helpful. So we wanted to find a way to make sure that we could actually drive the ball forward without trying to tackle this entire issue. And so we've focused on patching. Right now, we're wrapping up a process where for over a year, we've had security researchers, device manufacturers, ISPs, consumer advocates all come together and say, patching should be part of the IoT experience. Every device that we have, we should understand how to update it when we do find security flaws, security updates. But there's no one-size-fits-all. This isn't purely a technical solution or purely a policy solution. So we have working groups that are looking at both sides of the problem. Some are focusing on how do we help large enterprises make good decisions when they're buying things, and how do we help manufacturers understand how to not introduce more risks when they're thinking about patching. And we've had another group saying, what should people communicate to consumers, and what should consumers look for? And how do we boil down this complex issue into a few things that I can tell my 72-year-old father to look for? So I think we've made progress on that. We're going to continue to move forward. The broad vision here is to say, let's find areas in security where voluntary action can be made by bringing people together and saying, as a community, we're going to hold hands together and jump in the pool together. The nice thing about this is, in this case, NTIA doesn't have to get in the pool. We're not the people who are organizing it. We're the people who are trying to get people to hold hands and count to 3 together. And that's moving forward. So, summing up, in case you fell asleep now, everyone can wake up. What have we talked about? It's a complex issue. We need to understand the multiple dimensions of it. Commerce is making a real difference, and NTIA has this lovely tool that we try to use across the ecosystem to bring different parties together and make progress moving forward. So now, some practical advice, because this is something that I think everyone should be able to give advice to those in their lives. What do you need to do? First, make sure your devices are up to date. Does everyone have an iPhone in this room? Anyone have an iPhone? Can you pull it out right now? And just go to Settings and General and Software Update and make sure there's no number next to it. This is something that you need to also check. People in your family, your friends. Hey guys, people are actively exploiting these bugs that Apple and Android are fixing. So we need to be on top of it. Make sure your software is up to date. Don't, on your personal machines, keep I'll update later, I'll update later, I'll update later. For your passwords, Strongly recommend using a password manager. Always a little difficult in the work personal barrier, but there are a lot of tools to understand how best to do this. Google how do you use a password manager. There are trusted neutral sites like Consumer Reports, like the National Cybersecurity Alliance that have advice on how to set this up. There are products that are free. There are products that are fairly cheap. If you have the option to set up two-factor authentication, please do so. Who's on Twitter? Anyone on Twitter? Everyone have two-factor authentication, at least with the SMS set up, so that no one can take over your Twitter account? Especially if you work for a government agency, even if it's not an official Twitter account? Yeah, people do target government agency actors just to start saying random things. That's going to increase over time. Back up your files. This sounds like it's not security, but remember, attackers are coming in. They're trying to take over your computer. Even if you can pay ransom, it may not be the case that you'll get your data back. Sometimes the security is so bad or the breaches are so egregious that someone will have taken over your computer and then someone else will come along and just change the message. So they won't have the encryption keys. They'll just point you saying, please send the money to this address instead of the actual guy who has the keys address. And then finally, just be careful, right? This is one of those things that's easy to say, hard to actually do. I'm not going to give you the don't click links line, but don't plug your phone into a wall that you don't know about or any device that you don't know about. In airports, we have seen people set up small pieces of electronics behind an outlet so that they will try to inject malware onto your phone. Don't use Wi-Fi without a VPN in a hotel or an airport. These are common sense things. If you need instructions, this is the stuff that on Google you can find out whatever you need from reliable sources. So that is what you can do. Please be safe online. And with that, please tell me why we're wrong.
All right, great.
First question gets a book.
All right, incentive. Dave is in the back with a microphone. Questions in the room to start? No one? All right, I'll start with a WebEx question then. Let's see. How big of a threat is the latest Wi-Fi vulnerability, crack, to government-owned devices like laptops and iPads?
So the question is referring to a recent attack against many different types of Wi-Fi access points that essentially uses the WPA2 encryption, right? You enter your password to access the wireless network, and essentially it allows an actor who is in range of your wireless access point to intercept that data traffic. This is something that was widely reported. I think it is an important issue, but it is not a serious short-term threat for the following reason. If you are using a wireless network, even a trusted wireless network, your data should still be encrypted at a higher level. You should assume that, if you're doing work where the data as it flows might be compromised and valuable to an adversary, you should be talking to an encrypted endpoint, right? This is the little lock in the corner on the web. This is using secure email. So for me, the real risk is over time, people are going to find new and creative ways to attack it. They're going to leverage this type of attack to exploit poorly implemented security on the web or websites like that. And what I'm worried about is 2 or 3 years from now, we will still have home routers that will be vulnerable. We will still have wireless access services at public buildings, Starbucks or airports or anywhere around the world that will still be vulnerable. So over time, this is going to be a serious systematic risk. I do not believe this is a critical risk because for the work that we're doing in government, we should be depending on security at a different level. We shouldn't be just trusting the Wi-Fi security for that.
Great. Anyone in the room?
Work? Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I'm just wondering, after what you were saying about plugging things in at the airport, if you consider that safe. If you do that yourself, charge your phone?
I do not. I will. So we use phones. The way we connect with phones is through USB. Right. USB-C and USB-B and Apple's proprietary model. That allows data to travel as well. Now, most phones, when you're connected, so iOS will often say, hey, you're actually connected to a computer. Do you trust this computer? That is a security level that I think holds for now, but doesn't in the future. They sell small devices. That's a USB to USB converter. And for any of you who work with kids, this is a great science project to teach them how to do. You get to teach them a little soldering, is you can make what's called a USB condom that essentially strips out the data pin and only allows the power to flow. Or use an international charger. So I always have an international charger in my bag, which again strips the data out. But plug it into a wall, use a wall charger, rather than using the USB port.
Okay, but like you wouldn't plug it in the wall at the airport.
So the airports increasingly have a USB port.
Right.
And I'm saying don't plug it into the USB port. You can you can get AC from the wall.
Okay.
But don't plug it into the USB.
Okay, thank you.
In the room?
You get a book.
I've heard some about cooperation between government and private on active defense, like hacking back, and I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on that cooperation.
So we are going to pretend that there's no such thing as legislation for the following answer. When we understand what to do in response to an active attack, because people are going to attack, there's a wide range of things that you can do, other than just put up walls. So one thing you can do is to say, I'm going to try to keep the attacker busy. So on my corporate network, or on my government network, I'm going to have things that look really important, but they're actually booby-trapped. So that's something that we refer to as active defense. I'm going to affirmatively take steps so that whoever is trying to attack my network doesn't just hit a flat wall, but I'm actively obfuscating the work they're doing. I'm putting beacons in the things that they are exfiltrating so that when they try to open this Word document that seems really cool, it alerts something over the internet and I can actually trace it back. There are countermeasures for the attackers against all of these things as well. That is one approach to active defense. There is another buzzword called hack back, which is someone's attacking me, then I can attack them back. This is problematic for many reasons. Who is attacking you and what the attack looks like. Or maybe even better, it's I'll get the data back. That's not really how data flowing across a network works. It's like, well, the data's sitting on this machine, so clearly I just need to get it back. Well, you can zero out that kind of data, but one, are you allowed on that machine? What else is that machine doing? When you try to talk to that machine, are you going to disrupt what it's doing? Maybe it's in a school somewhere around the world and you've just disrupted that, or God forbid, a hospital. But you're not actually going to prevent someone from getting your data because they probably already have your data. You're not accomplishing anything. And then you have scenarios of, well, there's a whole bunch of traffic that's coming across the network and targeting my system and trying to knock my system offline. So surely I can just go and attack the machine that's attacking me. And again, that's not really how attacks work. The way someone who will try to overload your machine is they'll take over a bunch of other machines, and one, you can't possibly go after all of them as the good guy. You can't possibly go after all the good guys, and even if you can go after them, again, you don't know what those machines are. They're victims just as much as we are. So understanding what hack back means, there's a range of things that we can do in active defense as we start to move from active defense to sort of, we'll call active forensics. The attack is happening from this box that's sitting in some other country. Well, what can I see about that box? What's the network that it's on? That's when you start to cross little lines. There are companies that do that just to learn about who is attacking me, to figure out what the threat is. But crossing the line from investigation to disruption, I don't think is a terribly sensible option, not least of which because it's not going to help you.
Okay, great. In the room, one more.
Hi, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about international cooperation on cybersecurity and where the multilateral fora are that are working and that type of thing.
The international component is absolutely critical, right? Americans sort of forget that there are other countries sometimes. It takes the form of, but again, just as cybersecurity is not a single issue. We're talking about cooperation. That covers everything from mutual law enforcement assistance treaties, which I think we've done a decent job at. In fact, the United States works very closely empowering other law enforcement agencies around the world to study cybercrime, to do the forensics work so that we can know what to do. We're working on harmonizing laws so that, what's a crime in one country is a crime in another country. That's very powerful. At the other end, you have something called capabilities development, capabilities building, which is there are just countries that don't know how to think about cybersecurity strategy and cybersecurity policy. And we work very hard, especially in this building, to help other countries understand how to defend themselves. And that can take be as high level as let's help countries write strategies. What is country X's cybersecurity strategy? To saying, all right, here's a particular industry that you're worried about, or here's a particular threat. Let's walk through what you need. And of course, there is a trade component to that as well. We work to both foster the local economies around the world, but also, the big tools and a lot of the best work are American companies. So we benefit a lot as we work with other countries.
Okay, super. We have a whole bunch from WebEx. Hopefully we can get to most of them. What's the best succinct message we can tell the public who entrust us with their information that their data is safe?
Sorry, try that one more time, please.
What is the best succinct message we can tell the public who entrust us with their information that their data is safe?
I think it is we encrypt it and we limit access to it. And that we understand what that access pattern looks like. Communicating that to the public is always difficult. A lot of discussions around cybersecurity sort of end up in this cul-de-sac around awareness and education. We're never going to help people who may be very smart, but security isn't their thing, so we can't really convince them just by using technical jargon. So what we have to do is make sure that we're following our own rules.
Great. Why not turn consensus agreements into regulations?
So there's a couple reasons. The shadow of the future is the power of the consensus discussion is that we get people to come to the table as the alternative. They know that this is not a sustainable, that the security situation today is not sustainable. And companies do like to use this as an argument to those who do want to regulate, saying, listen, we are working. And it's our job to make sure that there's teeth behind it, that this isn't just wasting time, that we're actually moving forward. But more practically, again, it's not entirely clear, if you were to give me the magic pen, what the regulation should be. Security involves so many context-specific decisions that any approach that is going to apply to a wide swath of the economy is going to necessarily be very high level and thus hard to have real teeth behind unless it looks like Sarbanes-Oxley.
Any more in the room? I've got a slew of WebEx.
Thanks for this informative presentation. I have a question about Experian and what you think the consequences ought to be for that breach, given that there aren't regulations in place to combat it.
Can I tack a secondary question on that's
Sure.
related for WebEx? What are your thoughts on the responsibility for the secondary costs to recover from an attack like that as well?
So the challenge of data in this context is incredibly tricky because when the courts have said that privacy breaches only matter in as much as there's an economic cost. The risks that we're seeing from identity theft are quite difficult, and I'm going to take 2 minutes to answer this in a slightly roundabout way. We've been sold a bit of a bill of goods, and again, this is not an NTIA approach, but when we are thinking about identity theft, right? We know how to think about theft. I put my bottle here, and if we just say anyone who comes near that bottle, we take away a finger, right? That's deterrence. That's how we think about theft. We have law enforcement, but we also imply that there's a certain amount of responsibility that I have to protect myself, right? Why am I leaving my water bottle out in the open with all these sketchy Commerce Department employees here? don't park your car in that neighborhood. Shred your documents. We imply there's a certain amount of personal responsibility that we assume. When we talk about identity theft, that's not what's going on. What happens is I am entrusting my water bottle to a trusted party, and then someone else comes along and says, I'm Allan, I'd like my water bottle. There are still two parties involved in that exchange, but notice that I'm not one of them. It is between the bad actor, who again we can threaten with amputation, or it's the authenticator. And we need to figure out how to incentivize and empower that authenticator to make good decisions. And sometimes the cost of when they try to go for efficiency or their profit motives don't reflect the true social harms. Now, the challenge we have in the entire credit model stems from where the harms are, and in fact the benefits of this theft, right? Insurance, when you get identity theft insurance, a lot of that money ends up going to the 3 data brokers because they're the ones who actually manage the flow inside and out of this organization. So if they have that responsibility, we need to make sure they understand it. For me, I'm not worried about how I'm affected by the recent attack against Equifax, because there are so many people that are affected. For it to affect me personally, we're going to break the entire system. And that's what's far more at risk for me, is we don't have a clear idea what the alternative is going to be if we aren't using all of this data that companies keep. The way that I authenticate myself to a credit rating agency is they ask me a question that only they and I know the answer to. Right? They have all this data about me, where have I lived, where have I worked, and in theory, no one else has that data. And that's what we use as a core authentication technique. That doesn't work if that data is out public. And I know my colleagues, formerly at NSTIC and in NIST, in the Trusted Identities Group, are working a lot on that issue.
Great. With the recent Kaspersky ban, do you think the US government should start thinking about its own antivirus solution?
I know that the US government does spend a lot of time thinking about its antivirus solutions.
All right, there that is. Anyone else in the room? I still have a few more on WebEx in the front.
You had said earlier that you would talk about insurance in the cybersecurity world. Can you expand on that a little bit?
So insurance is one of these issues that if any room of people talking about cybersecurity policy, it inevitably starts talking about insurance. Because it's a lovely model. We have a bunch of companies that don't understand what their risk is, and but if they have a policy that will pay out if there's a security incident, then now you have an insurance company that's sitting across, and they'll see a lot of data about incidents, and they'll be able to tell companies what they can invest in to make themselves better off, because the insurance company doesn't want to pay out. And so you're concentrating accountability from an economic perspective, and so that can drive, in theory, risk mitigation. You're having the decisions made by the people who are in a position to do so. That is all good policy. You want to align incentives. The problem is, I've got a file going back to 2003 that says 2003 is the year of cyber insurance. 2007 is the year of cyber insurance. It's always just about to take off. And the reason it hasn't is twofold. One, we don't really know what the harms to me of a cyber attack are. If I'm a company, I don't have a clear understanding of following a security incident. What is my dollar value that I need to make whole? We know it's bad, but we have a hard time translating that, even all the way up to the board level, of what it might be. And because of that, I don't know how much coverage to buy. And because of that, we don't see a real market, or the market is small enough that the contracts aren't very big, so people aren't going to invest a lot of money just because an insurance company tells them what to do. Moreover, if an insurance company really wants to absorb some of my risk, they need to know what my existing risk posture is, which means I need to have a security audit. But those are expensive. And either I'm big enough that I can do a security audit myself and I can self-insure, or I'm small enough In which case, if I'm willing to pay for a security audit, I can figure out what I need to invest in anyway. I don't need the insurance. There are certain areas where we do see insurance, and those are areas where there's defined harm. So you can get turnkey insurance today against data breaches, because we know what a data breach costs. It's how many records does my company have, and a coefficient of what sector I'm in, and maybe a little bit about what other regulations I'm liable to. So defined cost, flourishing insurance market. Everyone says we don't have the data. I disagree. We have tons of data, right? It's all machine data. And frankly, the insurance industry will underwrite anything you want without extensive data. We just don't have the demand around it. And it's the other area we're seeing insurance is something called CEO whale fishing fraud, where a company will break into your network, a criminal gang will break into your network, they'll watch what's going on, they'll figure out the patterns of communication, and then when your CEO is abroad, the CFO will get an email that is forged coming from the CEO saying, hey, I need you to, this deal's on the line, I need you to send a bank transfer to this random Caribbean account. And people actually do that, but they can do that to the tune of, $2, $3, $5, $10 million. And so there are companies that will buy insurance against that.
Great. Allan, how are you on time?
I think we're over time here, but I can do one more question if there's one more question.
Okay, we have, I will just point out before we do the final question that Allan's contact information is on that last PowerPoint slide, or you can send questions to us and we will forward them on. I have a whole bunch on WebEx that unfortunately we just don't have time for today, but please reach out and ask these questions if we weren't able to get to yours today. I guess the final question we can ask, I'll try and make it an upbeat one, not related to crazy cyber attacks, is, where was that one? Is there an opportunity to train individuals who want to pursue a career in cybersecurity within the government? And maybe some resources people could turn to?
That is a fantastic question. Cybersecurity workforce is a priority for this department. There's a group in NIST called NICE, which Rodney's going to kill me for not remembering what it stands for, but it is devoted to understanding the cybersecurity workforce challenge. There is probably some good information there. In terms of people who are already in government, the one thing I will say is security doesn't need people who are just experts in the technical side, especially when they're starting out, because it takes you a while to learn. You need to learn on the job. Where security needs real experts are people who are bringing their own pre-existing expertise to the security side. How do the role of international standards impact cybersecurity and trade? How does law enforcement, how does any aspect of government or the way we think about data inside? You're a database person, great. We have lots of database people, we need database and security people. So pivot to that. And the final thing I'll say is that there is a great program called the Cyber Scholars, where the government run through NSF will pay for undergraduate and graduate degrees in cybersecurity, where for every year that they pay in terms of tuition and they even give you a stipend, you owe the government a year of service, which is a great way of learning on-the-job training.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Friedman.
The final thing I do want to say is this department has incredible experts on cybersecurity. Every bureau has very hardworking security people on the operational side, on the policy side. They're sprinkled all throughout government. So please, we work together. There's a weekly call on Mondays to think about cybersecurity policy. Happy to chat more and point you to the person who runs that.
Someone piped up with the National Initiative for Cybersecurity Education.
Thank you.
Yes. Thank you so much, Dr. Friedman. Again, apologies if I couldn't answer everyone's questions. Reach out, and Dr. Friedman will help out. So thanks again.
Thank you for your time.